The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. We're at the top of the hour, and we have a lot to cover, so we do want to go ahead and get started right away. Thank you so much for joining us for Success at Every Level, HiPo Development Strategies for Accelerated Succession Planning. We're thrilled to have you here. We hope wherever you are in the world, your weather is a little bit better than what we're experiencing here at MRG headquarters. It's a blizzard here, so please forgive us if you hear some plow trucks backing up in the background. Hope you're huddled up tight wherever you are if you're experiencing the same thing. So my name is Lucy Sullivan, and I'm your host today. And before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping. We're recording today's webinar, and we're going to send you the slide deck. There's a lot of great content here. You will get that. You'll also get a link to the recording if you want to share it with someone else or check it out again. So that will all be delivered to you by the end of this week. So take that into account in your note-taking. You will be able to get those slides. And due to the size of the audience, we have a great turnout today. Everyone is in listen-only mode, but we absolutely want to hear from you and want your terrific questions. So as we go through the webinar, you don't have to wait until the question time. Just type your questions into the question box in your webinar navigation tool, and we'll get to them as many as we can during the webinar. And we leave no question unanswered, so we will also get to you. If we don't have time during the hour, we'll follow up with you afterwards to make sure you get your answers. So just a little bit about us here at MRG. We're a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. We have solutions for leadership and personal development, sales, and service. Our tools are research-backed, they're insightful, and we focus on action-inspiring feedback and fostering a deeper self-awareness for growth. The tools are used by more than 1,500 certified practitioners in over 40 countries around the world. You can find us on LinkedIn, you can find us on Twitter and YouTube. We're also a certified woman-owned business. And speaking of women owners, our presenter today is Tricia Nadav. Tricia is the president of MRG. She's been working with individuals, teams, and organizations for over 30 years, consulting, coaching, product design, research, and she also shares MRG's research and learnings around the world. She is a TEDx speaker, a contributor to Association of Coaching magazine, speaks at conferences in the US and around the world. In fact, she just returned from Australia, sharing some new findings there. So she will be a pleasure to listen to today, as always. So without further ado, I give you Tricia Nadav.
Thank you, Lucy, and hello, everybody. Just as Lucy said, we are in the middle of a blizzard, and I think it's Mother Nature's way of telling us it's not over till she says it's over. But we're tucked in and happy to be with you. This is the first time we've shared this research with an audience, so thank you for being our thinking partners as we explore insights into high potentials and what distinguishes a high potential leader. We're also going to look at what distinguishes a high potential leader who's currently seen as effective versus those who aren't quite there yet, and yet people are betting on them. We're going to talk about the blind spots that high potential leaders have in their approach to leadership. And then we're going to move on to succession planning, and we're going to explore how we get high potential leaders at each level to be ready to be highly effective at the next level. So in the succession planning journey, we've got a little bit of a map to guide people through. So we're going to start by just level setting across the group and see where everybody is. We're going to do a poll, and what we'd like to know is we know some of you with us today are inside organizations, and some of you are external consultants helping multiple organizations. So we ask you to think about this question from the vantage point of whether you're inside or whether you're external. We'd really like to know what you're seeing with the organization or organizations you're working with. So as they're thinking about succession planning, would you say that they would describe the succession planning that they are actively building a developmental pipeline? They're all the way in, they're doing it, and they're doing it well. B, they're keeping a few people in mind who could be good leaders. So if somebody retires or leaves the organization, they have a couple people in mind. Or C, you're basically planning on relying on external searches. More of your clients or your internally are planning on, well, if we have a gap, we hire externally. Or are you in an organization or working with organizations right now who just can't even think that far ahead? They're working very tactically, and high potential development and succession planning is not on their minds right now. So I know you're probably in multiple places if you're dealing with multiple organizations, or even if you're in a single organization, depending upon where you are, it may be different, but just give us a shot about what you think the majority mindset is around succession planning. And the poll is launched, so just click away. I know for some of you this is early, so take a sip of coffee and click. How are we doing, Lucy?
We're doing well. We've got a nice response rate coming in. I'll give everyone just a couple seconds more if you haven't voted yet. All right, thanks everyone. And let's see those results. So about 40% are building an active developmental pipeline, about 43% keeping a few people in mind who could be good leaders, 10% planning to rely on external search, and 7% just not thinking that far ahead yet.
Great. That's a great mix. So we're going to dive in and we're going to try to make sense of all of this. But let's start by just gathering our thoughts. We're probably preaching to the choir here, but let's just look at the main benefits of succession planning. Of course, organizational continuity and longevity. We're planning for the future. And if we're planning for the future, it makes us more strategic as an organization, because if we're planning for the future, we're not just planning talent, we're planning what we need on a longer term basis. So it builds the strategic mindset of the organization. It, of course, makes increases the availability of talent. It increases readiness. We are thinking ahead, so we're developing people ahead of the curve. When we do that, when we're thinking strategically and we are developing people, there is greater confidence internally. People feel like the organization is on top of what's happening on a longer term basis, but it also gives assurance to our external constituents, whether we're publicly traded and it's shareholders or it's our customers or vendors or suppliers or key relationships. We look like we are ready for what is coming down the pike. We also get better retention. We know there's talent shortage in many industries, and so if we're an organization that says we are looking to the future and we are developing people for the future, we increase our retention rate. And finally, what can be a little bit more controversial is we're making a wiser use of the investment in talent development. At MRG, we have a strong belief that if you are running an organization, you should be funding development for all members of your organization. But we also see that there are two common developmental tracks. One that we call an evolutionary developmental track, which is a sort of slower, more ongoing developmental track. And there's an accelerated developmental track for people who are at a higher state of readiness or a higher state of motivation or interest in a faster path. So how do you figure out who you are investing in from an evolutionary perspective and who are you investing in from an accelerated path? Succession planning is also really important right now. You know, it's been important always, but we have some things that are happening, dynamics at a crossroads of where we are right now, and this is happening around the world, that is making this even more important for organizations. First of all, this very large population of baby boomers around the world is retiring, and they're retiring quickly. In the US alone, baby boomers are retiring at an average of 4 million a year. We also have what's called a leaky leadership pipeline. The generation that is coming into the workplace now is reporting less interest in working their way up the leadership ladder than the generations before. Now, this may change as they get older, but right now there are a higher percentage of younger leaders who are more interested in a level of balance that for them precludes taking on more and more responsibility. We also have many people who are opting along their career to exit out of the leadership evolution up the ladder to either stay where they are or to navigate outside of the organization to smaller organizations where they have more flexibility. So we don't have as robust a pipeline as we may have 10 or 20 years ago. Labor markets are tighter. They're particularly tighter in key areas geographically and in key industries. We know that different aspects of of society need an increased level, for example, of healthcare, and we know the healthcare market is tight. We know we need increased levels of resources in technology, and that market is tight. So labor markets are tighter, which makes employee engagement even more critical, not only for organizational success, but for retention. So we have, if not a burning platform, at least a smoking platform. What organizations have done who are less sophisticated and or are spending less time on high potential development and succession planning is they've said, we'll be able to rely on external talent. We're an attractive place, we pay well, so we'll be able to hire externally. But external hires aren't always the answer. Again, reflecting back not only on the tight labor market, but there's been a fair amount of research that tells us that external hires can come with a cost. In particular, they can come with a cost in 3 areas. The first is training. And what the research shows is that knowledge and skills are not as transferable as we think they are. So if somebody is successful in one firm and looks like they have the capabilities that you want in your organization, that capability transfer often is not as smooth or as complete as we expect. The second is external hires tend to be more expensive. External hires tend to get paid 18 to 20% more than internal hires. So we've got a higher cost associated with bringing people in from the outside. And finally, performance metrics show that external hires often perform lower in their first 2 years than the internal hires. Part of that is cultural adaptation. Part of that is networking, less of a network internally. And part of that is just all the informal aspects of how things get done in the organization take quite a while to learn. And for some external hires, they never quite make that adaptation. So how are we doing on all of this? So the Human Capital Trends from Deloitte, they do this study every year. And in 2016, they looked at how we were doing on managing this leadership pipeline. And of the organizations that responded to the survey, 14% described themselves as strong in succession planning. So a majority of them not feeling like they had mastery yet. 13% of the organizations said they were excellent at building global leaders. So a gap there in terms of building leaders who can work cross-culturally. And only 7% of the organizations said they were excellent at building millennial leaders or Gen Y, the new generation of leaders that are navigating through the pipeline right now. So we know that high potential development, high potential identification and succession planning are both complex and they're challenging. So what we wanted to bring into the conversation is an evidence-based approach to navigating through high potential identification, high potential development, and succession planning. It is not a panacea, and it doesn't answer all the questions, but it grounds the process in leadership research that gives us a leg up and will make it a little bit more straightforward and a little bit easier to identify high potentials, to develop them, and to help navigate high potentials through the succession planning process. So let's talk about this first study we're going to share. Where does the data come from? I know many of you on the call know about MRG's Leadership 360. For those of you who are new to us, the LEA 360 is MRG's multi-rater leadership assessment instrument. It is used in about 40 different countries right now. We have over 1 million leaders in our database. And so for this study, we used data from the LEA 360, and we're looking at, for this study, feedback from observers, so bosses, peers, and direct reports. So what does the LEA 360 measure? The LEA 360 measures 22 different leadership behaviors and 30 leadership competencies. And by behaviors, we mean very specific, discrete, observable actions that we see as building blocks. So an example of that is feedback, which in our world is providing specific and direct reaction to others' thoughts, ideas, actions, and performance. So it's discrete and it's very specific. And the way that we measure it in the LEA 360 is self and observers aren't measuring how good somebody is at feedback, they're measuring how often they see somebody exhibit the behavior. When we want evaluation feedback, we turn to the 30 competencies that are measured in the LEA. And competencies for our purposes today are a set of behaviors used effectively in combination to deliver a certain outcome. So one of the competencies we measure is ability to develop people. And in this, we're asking observers to rate how effective is the leader at this. So this is an evaluative measure. Behaviors are descriptive, competencies are evaluative. And competencies are very complex structures. For example, this competency alone, ability to develop people, requires the use of 13 of these discrete behaviors. So it's a complex set of behaviors that in order to effectively exhibit the competency. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the 22 behaviors. You'll be seeing a lot of these as we go through and look at the research. So the LEA measures 22 behaviors, and we divide them into 6 different functions. The first function, creating a vision, measures the behaviors emphasized associated with the thinking elements of leadership. Developing followership measures the behaviors associated with building commitment, while implementing measures the behaviors around the start of the execution, the start of implementation. Following through measures how you behave to engage with others to keep things in the process through completion. Achieving results measures the behaviors associated with achievement and power in leadership. And finally, the team playing behaviors measure the behaviors associated with how the leader engages with others. So the nuts and bolts of this study. We have over 26,000 leaders in this study. The data was gathered through the assessment process over the last 5 years. This is a global study, so we have over 30 countries and over 30 industries. We have a male percentage of 49% and females of 30%. Our demographics are voluntary, and so we have 21% unreported. We have all the generations that are represented in leadership right now, from silence, baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y. So it's a very diverse population. We also have multiple job functions and multiple management levels. You will hear a little bit more later in the presentation about how we've looked at both high potentials and leadership effectiveness at these different management levels. So stay tuned for a little bit more detail there. So let's dive into the first study. What we really want to know in this first study is what behaviors distinguish leaders who are seen as high potentials. So how are these high potentials leading in ways that are different than people who are seen with less future potential? So first, how do we measure high potential? In those 30 competencies, we have a competency that measures the degree to which observers see an individual as having high potential. So the question is, to what degree does this person have future potential? Do they have the ability to go beyond their present level versus has reached their full potential and is likely to be a major resource to the organization? And you can see it's a 7-point scale where they rate anywhere from has limited potential to has unlimited potential as a major resource. And what we did is we looked at the people who got the top 10% of the scores along this continuum. So for those of you who really like to know specifics, when the average observer score for bosses, peers, and direct reports was at a 6.34 or higher, you were classified as a high potential. And so here is the first set of data we have out of this study. So some of you may be very familiar with this, and many of you, this may look like a very new graph. So what we have is across the bottom, we have the 22 behaviors that are measured in the LEA. The high potentials, those designated at the highest levels of that future potential rating, are designated in green, and all others in the sample are designated in blue. So just visually, you can see we've got a distinction, a behavioral distinction, and quite a number of behavioral distinctions between how high potentials approach leadership and how people who are not as high on the potential continuum approach leadership. So let's break this down a little bit. As I said, there are 14 behaviors that distinguish this. So that's a lot out of a model that only has 22. So there's a lot of distinguishing characteristics here. Let's look at them in themes. The first theme, innovative, strategic, and technical, is a cognitive theme. These high potential leaders are emphasizing behaviors associated with thinking more than their less potential counterparts. Innovative, thinking about new and different ideas. Technical, being very disciplined and having a strong technical expertise. Strategic, thinking long-term and big picture. Management focus, production, and control are about how we use our power and achievement focus to get things accomplished. So management focus is really assuming responsibility for the leadership role. Production is setting stretch goals and challenging people to work hard to achieve them. And control is tracking and monitoring to make sure we get things finished. So the collective focus is on stretch achievement and completion. Excitement, empathy, communication, and persuasion are about how we engage in the communication process and in the relational process. So excitement is about building enthusiasm. Empathy is about building close connection with others. Communication is how clear you are with expectations and information, and persuasive is how compelling you are at influencing people. So these high potential leaders are spending a lot of energy in communication, persuasion, and engagement, but with a close connection. But there's a warmth to it when you have empathy in that mix. What are they emphasizing less than the people who are seen with less potential? So there's a couple of themes here as well. Authority, structuring, and conservative are all about being careful and cautious. Authority is about being deferential to people in authority and making sure that you are carefully aligned with the people above you in the organization. Conservative is being very attentive to risk and moving things slowly so that you don't overstep beyond what you can see for risk. And structuring is about being very detailed and very process and very rule-driven in your way of doing it. So all three of those create a level of containment in approach to leadership. And then finally, the last dynamic where the high potential leaders are emphasizing less than their lower potential counterparts is this dimension we call self, which is how independent you are in your thinking and how independent you are in your actions. So we can really see while the high potential leaders are emphasizing that cognitive space, they're also high engagement leaders. So you can imagine a lot of dialogue and give and take, so they're not isolating themselves. So there are strong themes that differentiate these folks from those who are seen as less potential. So let's reflect on this group at another level. It's interesting to us, although probably reflects reality, that there's a distinction when we look at the high potential pool that not all of the high potential folks are seen as currently very effective. So where are those high potential leaders who are not seen as currently effective? Where is the risk point for them? Somehow people are seeing them as having high potential, but they're struggling right now. How do we help them? How do we understand what aspects of their approach to leadership might be getting in the way and potentially putting a high potential at risk for derailment? So how do we measure total effectiveness? So you remember that we measure 30 competencies. And so what we do in looking at effectiveness is we take the average of all of those 30 competencies. And for this particular study, we looked at the high potential leaders who were seen as above average on all 30 versus those who were seen below average on those 30 competencies. And we looked at the differences between them. So high potentials, above average effectiveness on this grid are seen in green, and below average are seen in blue. And you can see here there are quite a number of differences between the two. So how do we understand the risks that the below average high potentials have, and how do we help them? All right, there are 13 competencies here. So again, it's a big gap between the high effective, high potential folks. So how do we help them? Well, a couple of things. The high effective potential leaders are placing more emphasis, again, on that cognitive space, that strategic thinking long-term, that technical really using and cultivating their level of professional expertise. They are more focused on production. So the high potential, high effective are more focused on achieving results and setting stretch goals and keeping those goals in front of the people that they're leading. they are more connected at that team playing level. When you're a high potential who's also highly effective, a distinguishing characteristic is that you are highly engaged with others. So empathy, being connected to people, caring about them, consensual, seeking input from others, cooperation, willing to help and compromise. You are also really balancing at that high potential, high effectiveness place, communication and persuasive. So again, clear communication and creating this compelling way of bringing people in, of influencing. But interesting here, restraint is also here. So restraint is the moderator for over-communicating and or over-emoting. So here we have restraint, which says the high potentials, high effective, know how to regulate. They have some degree of reserve. They know how to stay calm when people are getting stressed. So it's this balance of engagement and calm restraint. What we also see is the highly effective high potentials place less emphasis on dominant and self. Dominant is how forceful and aggressive you are, and self is how independent you are in your thinking and action. So we can see the risk with the folks who are high potentials but less effective. They're playing the aggression card probably too hard. They're isolating them too much in that self space. We also see that the highly effective high potentials rely less on structuring and authority than do their less effective counterparts. So less on the authority structure above them, less on rules and processes. So there's probably more flexibility and more give. So if we want to be thinking about how we take that pool of people that we believe have high potentials but are struggling now, thematically we need to help them expand their cognitive capabilities and cognitive engagement. We need to help them engage more closely with others through the empathy, consensual, and cooperation. We need to help build their persuasive strategies and their communication skills, and we need to balance their assertiveness. When you combine slightly higher restraint and less emphasis on dominant and self, you have a calmer, less aggressive, less independent demeanor. And then structuring and authority, it's not that we want them to abandon their connection with people above them in the organization, nor do we want them to abandon rules and processes that facilitate success. It's a question of not over-relying on them. So there's a way for us to think of development of high potentials who are not succeeding now to help them, because there is a fork in the road for these people. Many of the patterns that we see with the high potentials who are not currently high effective aligns with some of the patterns we see in our derailer research. So there's a fork in the road for these folks where they need strong developmental support. So let's take one more look at leadership in this high potential space. Let's look at what we call blind spots. We actually love this research. This is the research in a multi-rater database where you're looking at the gap between how self-participants perceive themselves and how observers perceive them. So all leaders have blind spots. It's why about 25 years ago, we all moved from self-assessments only to more and more multi-rater. We want leaders to increase their self-awareness, and part of that is getting a better understanding of how they're impacting others and how others see them. So we are looking here at high potentials, and we're looking at the gap between how high potentials see themselves and how their observers see them. All right, so that's the research. So we're looking at the self scores are in green here, and the combination of their observer scores, remembering this is boss, peers, and direct reports, and these are weighted averages. So we're looking at the gap in this space. And what we see is a number of blind spots, and blind spots sometimes can be things where leaders actually see have a blind spot around how effective they are, and then there can be blind spots where they're at risk. And the high potentials have both. So when we look at this mix, we see a few things. One, we see this self-score higher from the high potential perspective. That's actually not an unusual blind spot. We tend to be very aware of our own mental processing and our own almost individual contributor work. And so it's not unusual for leaders sometimes to see themselves as higher on self than observers do. We also see that there's a blind spot here, and that high potential leaders tend to see themselves as more outgoing than their observers do. This is going to become important when we look at some of the underestimation that we see. But basically what this is saying is high potential leaders see themselves as more social and more friendly than their observers perceive. High potential leaders see themselves emphasizing these behaviors less than their observers do. So the first is the whole cognitive piece: conservative, technical, strategic, and innovative. That's that cognitive piece we were talking about, where conservative is looking at risk, innovative is looking at new, untested, technical is looking at the degree to which I'm using my professional expertise in my leadership role, and strategic is long-term and bigger picture thinking. So this is also not unusual, because sometimes it's hard to distinguish for leaders how much of their thinking is being communicated into their observer group. So again, our cognitive processes are very internal, but what we want to be doing with these blind spots is we want to be expanding people's self-awareness, and we want to be able to help leaders get better and better at seeing how their behaviors translate to others and what kind of impact that has on others. What we're trying to do is maximize the awareness people have, because here's what leadership is. Leadership is the ability to create an impact on others in order to generate a certain kind of outcome or outcomes within a certain context with a certain set of resources. And what we know about leadership now is it's become so complex that we need a level of agility. And in order for leaders to know when I emphasize this behavior and when I pull back on that behavior in order to bring about a better outcome, they have to be very good observers of themselves. They have to be able to understand the translation between what I experience internally, what I demonstrate externally, and how it impacts my constituents. So even when the blind spot can tend to be more in their favor, we want to be very careful that we're helping them be able to see the connection between internal dynamic behavior and impact. The last set here is a set we want to be a little bit careful about. Control and production are the behaviors associated with setting stretch goals, production, and seeing them through to completion, control. They are extremely useful behaviors, but they can be overemphasized. And when they're overemphasized, particularly when there is not companion behaviors associated with close connection with others, or in this case, even the social connection that comes with outgoing, it can be overplaying the leadership power hand. So again, one of the things we have to watch, and we'll see this more when we get into the succession planning research, is we can see that where high potentials are successful, but also the risks for derailment if we don't help them continue to evolve. And part of helping them continue to evolve is expanding their insights into how they impact others. So we're going to pause for questions in just a second, but I wanted to share one more study with you. What we've been looking at up till now are behaviors and competencies and the blend between those two. And in particular, we've been looking at what behavior patterns distinguish different aspects of high potential leaders. We also wanted to look at, is there a distinction around motivation between high potential leaders and those who are seen with less potential? And so for this study, what we used is our motivational assessment. MRG's motivational assessment is called the Individual Directions Inventory. This database is also large with about 40,000 participants. It is also used globally, so this is also a global study, as the last one was. This one is a self-only assessment because it's motivation. We're measuring an internal perception of when I have more or less energy. And we're looking at 17 different motivators here. So what we're looking at here, we cluster this also in 6 different clusters. We're looking at the degree to which in affiliating, the degree to which you are energized by close connection with others. In attracting, we're looking at the degree to which the individual is energized by attracting positive attention to him or herself. Perceiving measures the degree to which somebody is energized working with knowledge and ideas and information. Mastering looks at the degree to which somebody is energized by working really hard to achieve. Challenging measures the degree to which somebody is energized by overcoming a challenge or overcoming obstacles. And finally, maintaining is measuring the degree to which somebody gets energized by maintaining their boundaries and keeping their world sort of the way that they want. Again, a multi-country study, so 15 plus countries. This has just under 3,500 participants, multiple industries, a mix of men and women, a mix of generations, multiple job functions in this, and a broad range of management levels. So it's a broad study. And so what we're looking at here is we are looking at the difference in motivation between people who get, again, those very high scores on that future potential competency and people who get scores below the very high scores. So you can absolutely see differences here. There are differences between the high potentials in green and those who are seen as not having as much future potential in blue. But you'll notice that the lines match up much more frequently than the behavior lines. And in fact, that's because there's much fewer distinctions in the motivational profiles of these two groups than there are in the behavioral profiles of these two groups. So high potential leaders are more motivated by the energy of giving. So that ties to the empathy that we saw behaviorally. So this is the motivation to nurture, to be generous, to be kind, to care for others. We see that high potential leaders are more motivated by excelling, which is the motivation that is often tied most strongly to the behavior of production. So this is the energy that these high potential leaders get from stretching and working hard and being ambitious. We also see that high potential leaders are more motivated by both of the attracting dimensions. So they're very motivated by attracting positive attention to themselves. Well, so gaining stature is being recognized for what you contribute, so being recognized by others. And entertaining is getting energy from being charismatic and drawing people in. I think these next two, though, are probably the most critical for us to think about, particularly as the world becomes more changing more quickly and we request more agility from our leaders. So high potential leaders are less motivated by structure and stability. Structuring is the energy you get from being precise and detailed and rule-bound and methodical. And stability is the energy you get from predictability and the energy you get from maintaining a tight hold on change. So there are some meaningful differences here, but these are less of a distinction than the behavioral distinction. And so that it shows us, I think, that high potential status is more aligned with things that we can develop in others and less aligned with fundamentals that are absolutely innate. So let's just quickly take a quick look at where we've ended up. There are significant differences between people who are seen as having a lot of potential and those who are seen as having anywhere from slightly to much less potential. High potential leaders who are seen as currently effective are different and in significant ways from their high potential counterparts who aren't seen as currently effective. And those currently less effective folks are at risk for derailment, but there are things that we can do to guide them back onto the tracks. There are a lot of individual and contextual differences when we look at high potentials. We've done a lot of research around what distinguishes high potentials from those who are seen as having less potential in multiple contexts and with multiple demographics. We don't have time to share all of that with you, but please be on the lookout for an email we'll send that gives you some insights into some of that other research that we've done. So we end up with some clear patterns we need to pay attention to, but no single definition of the high potential leader. So when we do this, when we use the assessment tools to increase the accuracy and the effectiveness at high potential selection. It doesn't make the miracle occur, but it does some really important things that help us all get on the same page around how we're identifying and how we're developing and how we're getting people ready for the next step. So it reduces the subjectivity, which of course reduces blind spots. Measuring that in-house talent more effectively and more comprehensively and also more universally lays the groundwork for helping us fast track development for people, but also to identify people at risk for derailment and getting them back on that track. It also gives us the ability to talk more strategically about future leadership needs. It lets us think very concretely about the leadership needs we need as we move our organizations forward. So I think we have time for maybe one question. Lucy, do we have one that bubbled to the top from your perspective?
Sure. A couple interesting questions, certainly about, different demographics and how that might impact. So like Tricia said, I think we'll have some more research coming your way that will help illuminate some of those. One question that came up was we were looking at highly effective HiPos. Surprised not to see management focus in there as one of the behaviors that distinguishes those highly effectives. Didn't know if you could comment on that.
Yes, so it is, I think, one of the things that people look for when they say this person has future potential is the fact, are the behaviors associated with management focus. So I think that the high potential space, people are, to get those higher scores on high potential, people see management focus. So it's not a distinguisher about effectiveness versus less effectiveness, but it is a distinguisher, I think, to get into the category of high potential. So I think it's just high potential, high effective, and high potential, less effective share the management focus. It's not the distinguisher. It's those other patterns of engagement that really distinguish that more or less effective space. I'm going to move us forward, but as Lucy said, we are going to make sure all your questions are answered in our follow-up. So please look for that. So please keep asking. We promise we answer them. And oh, by the way, we'll share them with everybody, so you won't miss out on somebody else's good question. Okay, so we found them. We've got the high potentials. We know some more about them. How do we take them to the next level? We call it high potential. So we've got to fulfill the potential somehow. How do we move them to the next level? And so what we're trying to do here is really look at how we move people from high potential to high effective. And so what we've done is we've distinguished we've looked again, this high potential are the people you are now familiar with. So you've seen that research, you have a little bit of insight into how we got to them and how they are behaving differently. We're introducing in this section highly effective leaders, and we're introducing them by category. So what we're trying to do here is show the movement from one level to another. So we are exploring what we need to focus on developmentally to take a high potential leader at one level and get him or her ready to be highly effective at the next level. So we're going to take you through the 3 leaps in that process to see how we move people through the pipeline at each stage. So here we go. Reminder, this is how we defined high potential. Future potential, again, it's the same thing, top 10%. How we defined high effectiveness here. So this is different than the last where we did above and below average. This we're looking at highly effective. So we take the average of the scores from all the observers on those 30 competencies, and we take people who landed in the top 10% of the scores. So highly effective across a complex set of leadership competencies. So the first leap we're looking at here is the leap from high potential individual contributor to highly effective first line manager. What does somebody have to do to make that developmental leap? So you can see here, highly effective is in blue. So highly effective first line manager is in blue, and high potential individual contributor is in green. All right, so we're looking at how do you shift your approach to leadership to move, in this case, from green to blue. Okay, so there are 9 behavior patterns that shift here in the movement from I am a hotshot individual contributor to I've just been given my first managerial role. So the first is you need to have more emphasis on delegation and consensual. Consensual is seeking input from others. Delegating is engaging others in the work and giving them some freedom to do it. Not surprising. This person has been an individual contributor, and now they need to learn a little bit more about bringing people in and using other people's talents to get things done. They need to place a little bit more emphasis on authority and structuring. So now you're part of the managerial system. So you've gone from being an individual contributor, you're part of the management pipeline now, and you're not just working on your own. So you need perhaps a little bit more structure in place to organize work for others and to have work make sense across a team. And you're in the leadership pipeline, so now you're speaking for people above you in the organization to others. And so you need to be a little bit more attentive to the leadership pipeline. You need to be a little bit careful both in your thinking and in the way that you express yourself. So conservative, you need to be a little bit more aware of risks because there's a multiplier effect because it's not just you now. So there's a risk management piece involved in the managerial space. And you need to be a little bit more reserved in what you show and how you express yourself so that you can be calm in the face of chaos or uncertainty for your direct reports. The effective first line managers also place less emphasis on a few things. So they are focused on production, but they're not as focused on production as the individual contributor who is often proving their ability to be effective by delivering at a very high level. They are less independent. So they're less isolated in their thinking and they're less independent in the actions that they take. And it's not that they're not innovative, they're just more balanced in the conservative, innovative space. So you're actually asking these individual contributors to make a big shift here from sort of out on the range, showing how smart they are and how independent they are and how innovative they are and how much they can do on their own, to toning that down to make space for others. It's a big shift. And some people, as we know, even though that they were exceptional individual contributor space, will struggle in this transition. So what about the next shift? The next shift is you are now a high potential first line manager, so you've made the shift. You are seen as having a lot of potential to move forward. People are valuing your contribution, and we want to make you a highly effective middle manager. We want this next leap to be successful for you. What do we need to pay attention to? So again, high potential, in this case, first line manager is in green. We're trying to get them into a behavioral pattern that looks more like the blue pattern, the highly effective middle manager. Okay, the first thing we need to know is it's a little bit bigger transition than the last one. This transition involves 11 behavioral transitions, where we saw 9 before. So this is a little bit more of a stretch. And what can be challenging is we move back a little bit on some of these. We shift back to a little bit of the patterns that look more like the individual contributor. Why might that happen? Because when you're a middle manager, you are more often managing first line managers. So you're higher up in the hierarchy, you're a little bit less close to the action, and you've got to have a different way of engaging. So what happens at this level? So first of all, we have a much deeper level of engagement. So consensual goes up even farther than it did the last time. Delegation goes up even farther than the last time. So you're managing managers oftentimes. So you want to get their input and you want to delegate to them. We want to push as much down as we can so that the work is happening at the level that it should. But we also have more empathy here. We're really paying close attention to the emotional dynamic and how people are engaging and how people are feeling. We are very attentive to our communication. When we move to middle management, our communication and our persuasive abilities need to become more sophisticated. We're communicating across multiple domains now, other departments, multiple levels up and down. We are deeper into the organizational network, so our persuasive abilities become more critical. And we're higher in the organization, so strategic becomes even more important. So I need to be thinking longer term and even bigger picture. I am less reliant on being independent than I was even at first line manager, and I am careful not to overuse dominant. One of the reasons that's important is as we go up in the hierarchy, we have more power. And so dominance sits more aggressively the more power we have. So we have to be very careful about not being over assertive as we go up the hierarchy. We have a little bit less deference to authority. Now we're higher up in the system, we can take potentially a little bit more risk. We are, again, not unattentive to production. We're just using more sophisticated levers to bring success about. We're not just hammering on the goals. We're involving people. We're influencing people. We're thinking more strategically. So we're using a more complex set of behaviors to facilitate achievement. All right, so that's 11 behaviors that we need to transition when we go from first line to mid. How about when we go from middle to senior? So now we're at high potential middle managers. They've crossed that great divide. They've been successful. People think that they can go farther, and we want to make them highly effective senior managers. Some big differences here. High potential middle manager, again, the high potential's in green. We want to get them to the behavior pattern associated with a highly effective senior manager, which is in blue. We have 14 behavioral differences here. So one of the things that's important is that the movement as we go up gets more and more complex. The developmental journey is more of a stretch. And I don't think we always think about that as specifically as we need to. What happens to get to the senior level? So we see a much richer engagement. So we keep seeing that empathy, consensual, and delegation. We keep getting better at that as we track that effectiveness. We see here that feedback, though, is also added. People need to know where they stand. And so highly effective senior managers are very good at giving straightforward feedback. But you can see it's coupled with this engagement space here. So it is specific and direct, but it's respectful. We also see this much more compelling way of bringing people along, bringing commitment. So management focus is really being out in front in that leadership space, but we see these people using multiple levers to engage people. They are social. They're making time to engage with people socially. They are building enthusiasm through excitement, and they are expanding their ability to persuade. We see that they balance now more conservative and innovative. So here we see innovative come back into the mix, but it's a balance of looking at the risk assessment and the opportunities at once. So back and forth. It's a sophisticated cognitive way of processing information and opportunities. We see them spending less emphasis on, and this goes down as we go up through middle and senior, less emphasis on structuring. So rules and processes and procedures are less a part of the leadership mix here. And deference to authority, of course, goes up because now I'm at senior leadership. So there's less above me and I am more the authority that people are deferring to. So we see less deference to authority. And we see less focus on both tactical and control, more because as you get up to very senior leaders, tactical is being very hands-on in the business, and control is tracking and monitoring. And both of those are more heavily emphasized at mid and first line leadership. So it's less energy spent at the senior level. So this is a big transition from even a highly effective, high potential middle manager has a big leap to make. And again, we know that some numbers of the leadership space won't make that, but you can see as we go to develop today's high potential leader into tomorrow's highly effective leaders, we have this approach that requires very specific leadership shifts. And what's interesting about this to remember is we often think about leadership shifts being adding more behavior, but these shifts are just as critical to understand the behaviors that you once relied on that you're going to rely on less frequently. Again, all of these leadership behaviors are in play for all leaders, but what we're trying to see is what patterns are you relying on that are more likely to bring about success as you move up. So we see that when we started this, we looked at the journey as if it looked like this. What the journey really looks like is this. It's a stretch to go from individual contributor to first line manager. It's a bigger stretch to go from high potential first line manager to middle manager. And the biggest stretch is it leaves for our middle managers moving to senior. So this road from high potential to high effective is, it's not easy, and it requires the commitment of the organization to provide the support that's needed. We see patterns in these high potentials, as I said before, that without guidance to the right developmental path, they can actually stay stuck in places and devolve into patterns of leadership we see associated with derailment. So what we're trying to do is really provide as much guidance and support as we can. And in the research that Deloitte has done, there are some very specific things that organizations do to support this at a systemic level. Not surprising, a very specific leadership strategy, using assessments, using the developmental resources that we know, on-the-job development, coaching, really providing stretch assignments, giving blended learning opportunities that are both self-study and shared study. But really using this research-driven content, because this work can be so subjective. And even with the research, we of course have to localize it, and we have to see what of it applies to our organizations or the organizations we're dealing with. But we need to start with some level of data and some science-based approach. Otherwise, it devolves very quickly into either no process at all or a very subjective process. So there are very clear insights, and we are going to be happily sharing a little bit more with you in subsequent messages. And how to get them from A to B is also pretty clear. But it requires a lot. It requires a lot on the organization's part. It requires a lot on those of us who are supporting development. But it's doable, and the science makes it more doable. But what we haven't really gotten a chance to talk about, and it really is near and dear to our hearts and our philosophy, if we can put this information in the hands of the leaders themselves, if they're clear on what the organization needs from them and why those leadership patterns support where the organization is trying to go, and if we can give them clear, deep insights that increase their self-awareness in a way that they can digest and take in, then what we are really doing is creating a community of leaders who can be the architects and engineers of their own leadership journeys and be more engaged participants in their own success and be better partners to the organization in creating the leadership we want moving forward. So I think we have time for one question, Luce.
Sure.
We have one that rises to the top.
Yes, and we've had a lot of great ones, and again, we will get them answers to all of them post-webinar. But one interesting one that came up was, how would you convince your organizational officers and leaders of the value of a leadership pipeline that looks like this, that has these different levels and these differences at different levels throughout the journey?
I think one of the things that is really helpful in that is our derailment research, because the cost of leaders not being successful is pretty painful, and most organizations are aware. What's the cost of having a leader in place that is derailing or has already derailed, and what's the cost of actually having to replace that leader? So I think that's one, and we can get that research to you. I think the other thing is the research that's coming out about the cost of external hires, the fact that they're not panning out as well, and most organizations actually have that data within HR around what the turnover is and how successful these folks are, and if you have good performance evaluation data, what the performance evaluation data is, and what the cost is, how much are we paying those folks compared to the others. I think the idea of confidence in the shareholder or and customers and internal confidence, and I think finally, because we've seen the engagement scores so tied to profitability, we're getting a little bit more attention there. And one of the key differentiators around high engagement versus low engagement is I have a career here, and my organization has a developmental path that I can see myself on. So there are several. We can do more than a 1-2 punch. We can probably give them a 6-7 punch to bring them around. I think for some people, I'll say one last thing about that. I think for some organizations, it feels so overwhelming. It's not because they don't buy into it philosophically. It's because they don't even know where to start. And it feels completely overwhelming. And so I think starting with some research can help. Okay, it doesn't answer everything, but it gets us a concrete start about how to think about our leadership and how to think about moving them through the different levels we need them for. So this was great. Thank you all. We're really excited to be reading your questions, and we'll get those answers out. It's exciting to be able to share this new research with folks, and
Absolutely.
we hope that you found it helpful.
Thank you, Tricia. Yes, and everybody keep an eye on your inbox. As Tricia said, some more of those terrific case building kind of research things, helping to get buy-in, will be coming your way. And also you can find some things that we have right now at mrg.com/research. You're welcome to visit us there anytime. We have white papers and on-demand webinars, coaching crib sheets, but definitely keep an eye on your inbox. We'll have some great supplemental material that will expand on this last hour coming your way soon. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next time.